Recently, Nature Change joined Jerry Dennis on a visit to Michael Delp's cabin on the banks of the Boardman River. Highly regarded, passionate writers, these old friends share some of their work and reverence for the rivers, lakes, and streams of northwest lower Michigan.
So I'm here with my really great friend Jerry Dennis, who for years and years and years has written so well about water and living in northern Michigan. He knows probably every trout stream in Michigan. He knows every canoeing river in Michigan. And he's a really, really important voice. He's the voice of water that doesn't have a voice. I mean, he represents water, and he's out there all the time. He's in the water all the time. So he has a voice that's authentic, and it resonates with people because he literally knows what he's talking about. He's not making this stuff up. And I can't tell you how many books he's written, and if you look at that list of books, if you see it on your bookshelf, there's a lot of books there, and that's because A, he knows what he's talking about, and B, he has an incredible work ethic. And that all translates into that voice that we need primarily for the Great Lakes, and in a wider sense, the world's water, but the Great Lakes is where I think Jerry's work is focused right now. So it's great to be with him here.
Well, it's great to be with you too, Mike. I've looked up to you since long before we met in the early 90s. I saw in your work a kindred spirit and someone I really wanted to get to know, because I felt that you understood northern Michigan in a way that few people I knew did, and that I could learn from you as an outdoors person, as a writer, as a human being. So I was thrilled when I finally met with you, and we saw right away, yeah, this is true. We are kindred spirits, and we are very different in our work, different kinds of writers, but we are both after the same thing much of the time. And what I admire most is your passion. There isn't enough passion in this world, and we need people who aren't afraid to stand up and let her rip. And
when you talk about that passion, when you look at the preface, I don't know if it's a preface or a foreword to the Living Great Lakes. The beginning of that book is so fierce that needs to be a mantra for saving what we have in terms of the world's greatest supply of fresh water. And it just can't be said enough times. And so I hope that you might read from that a little bit later. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I hope you might read from that.
I'd do that.
And Joe was asking us about how we saw changes in terms of climate. I mean, that's a big concept. Climate change is a huge concept. Even though there are detractors out there, I just don't think you can deny that it exists. The biggest thing that I've seen change in northern Michigan, I mean, the weather changes, the winters have been odd, but to me it's a people thing. There have been so many people that come to this area. And when you're on a river like the Boardman, where we are now, it's a mixed-use river, and it gets hammered. It gets hammered every weekend. And so that's the biggest thing that I can see in terms of change around here. And I'm not a bird person, I know you are, and maybe you can speak to this. The bird ecology of this area has really changed a lot.
That's true, and we've seen that in just a couple of decades. Many birds that were unusual in northern Michigan, maybe even when we were kids, are pretty regular here. We had, I live on Old Mission Peninsula, and we documented last year the nesting of a pair of red-headed woodpeckers, and that's rare. There have been very few cases of red-headed woodpeckers. They're southern Michigan and below.
Wow.
And they got along just fine. They nested very successfully in our front yard in a dead maple. There's a lot of cases of that. That's been pretty carefully documented. And there's concern, in 1989, a long time ago, a professor at the University of California wrote a book about the coming climate crisis.
Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the examples he used of impact was Kirtland's Warbler in northern Michigan. So I did a review of that book and an interview with him for Audubon magazine. And what he discovered in his research was that as the climate changes, the jack pines are going to move northward. And that, of course, is where Kirtland's warbler, the most endangered songbird in North America,
real short
that's
jack pine.
where they are going to have to nest. And will they be able to? Will the conditions be right for them? The only way they succeed now is by controlled burns of the jack pines so that they rejuvenate, because they need jack pines like 12 to 15 feet high. They're the only ones they will nest underneath. And then there has to be real stringent controls of cowbirds to keep their nest from being parasitized. So his theory was that the Kirtland's warbler was going to be one of the first victims of wild, biological victims. And so that was why I was so interested in it. Hey, this is my home turf. What else is going to be happening? So we've been watching this for 30-some years.
You know, when that idea of what happens literally in the landscape with climate change bumps into the politics of climate change, especially in an area like Grayling, which is there's a huge military complex there. And they train in Kirtland warbler habitat. And I remember when I was in Grayling, I taught in Grayling for a long time, and there was a constant tension between the people who wanted the guard there for financial reasons and probably political or kind of, in my mind, misguided patriotic reasons, and the people that wanted to save that habitat. And so they were constantly pounding on each other, and they would post huge areas of jack pine and say, you may not enter here. And there were ranges that the National Guard, I mean, if you go to the ranges in Grayling right now, they look like the moon. I mean, it is completely destroyed over there. And so they would post some of the ranges, and so the Guard sometimes couldn't come and train in those areas. So that had a direct effect on the economy, and people were just livid that, you know, a tiny little bird would hold sway over a tank. But they don't understand that when you lose a species, that has an impact on every other species down the line. And you know, I think we've come around. We've started to learn. We started to learn what that means when you lose a species in terms of the chain. But it still scares me. You know, when you look around here, what's next? What is the next thing that's going to happen here? Is the river going to slow down? Is the river not going to have as many fish in it? Is it going to get used too much? That stuff really scares me, and I'm concerned about that.
I think I go at it in a couple different ways. One is I feel an obligation to document what's going on now for future generations, partly because I grew up reading those great histories of this area and of the rest of the country and the world. Hayes and Miller's The Old Au Sable was a real important book to me.
Yeah.
To see that picture of what that river was like really helped me to understand where we are in the bigger continuum, and made me think, okay, I want to leave a record that future generations will also look back on and say, oh, we've lost a lot, but there's still hope. We can still do something. The other approach and the other side of the coin for me is a very selfish one. I refuse to not do the work that I want to do, which is to write.
That's why it's good. You know, that's
well, thank you. It's to write with that power and passion about what I love. And what I love is at risk, but that's been true of every community through history.
It's never not been at risk. When you understand that where we're sitting right now was a logging river, and they just completely destroyed this river when they logged it. I mean, like they destroyed the mainstream in Grayling, the Au Sable. They destroyed that river in order to make money. And so, you know, my viewpoint is probably more political. When I think about the differences between Jerry and I, other than, you know, we're both addressing the natural world, and I think I'm probably more political. He's angry in a different way. Jerry's work is, I think it's more gracious about that, and it takes into consideration more. He has a wider lens than I do. My lens is really focused, and it's focused on primarily political things. that one of the reasons why we face all these crises is political. You know, we live in a state that has the world's most amazing supply of fresh water, but it gets defiled all the time. And if you're an environmental activist, you're like a short order cook in a really busy restaurant. There's a fire every day that you have to put out. And sometimes there's 5 or 6 fires. You know, it's big oil, it's big water coming in. They want to pump water, they want to steal water, they want to run pipelines all over the place. Line 5 certainly is an area. So in my writing, I think I try to address that, you know, like via the mad angler. He's mad. You know, he's crazy, but he's mad. He doesn't like this stuff because, you know, like Jerry and I were sitting out there on the deck, and the river, you know, it's been out there for thousands of years, and we think it's never going to stop. But maybe it might. You know, if we don't take care of it, it might stop, or it might become like the Cuyahoga did in the late 60s when it caught on fire. You know, and that mentality that looks at water as a commodity, it looks at water as a way to make money. You know, that's what defiled these rivers in the lumber era. They just destroyed these things. And I think both of us, in different ways, are trying to stop that from happening. And saying, you know, this, like Jerry's idea of being a witness is really powerful. You know, this is what we have. Why would you imperil this in any way? What could you be thinking?
It's really well put, Mike. Absolutely.
I mean, that's what he's writing about, is witnessing. He's witnessing something, which is different. It's a different kind of witnessing than I'm doing. That witnessing is you know, it's not about being more esoteric or anything like that. It's not about the difference between poetry and nonfiction. It's about literally being on the water and saying, this is what we're doing to this place.
I like to tell myself that I'm trying to cross partisan lines and trying to reach a variety of people with this, but I'm not sure that's true. Not too long ago, I was in conversation with an older gentleman from Brooklyn, and I got up on my soapbox and was talking about northern Michigan and about why I consider. He asked, what's so special? Why do I care about this? And what is there? And I went on and on and on and on about it. And finally he said, I don't get it. It's just a bunch of trees.
Yeah.
And I
much
laughed.
Work to do.
I had to laugh.
Yeah.
But then I said, but I've been in Brooklyn, and it's just a bunch of buildings. And he saw a little bit of what I meant, because you do have to get beneath the surface. You have to dig in before you start to understand what any place is and what's special about any place.
You know, I think when I think about that, when I look back at your work, and I think about trying to bridge that gap, there's a diplomatic side of you that I really, really respect, that says, you know, it's possible. There's somewhere it's possible to have that encounter with somebody like this guy who says, I really don't get it, and you say, well, you know, it's all tree. It's not. There's no trees in Brooklyn. There isn't a river within 50 miles of Brooklyn. Maybe the Hudson, you could catch a sheephead, but I think that's an interesting difference in our writing. Is that I love that side of him. I love that side of his writing. That's diplomatic, but I think over time, I've seen him get, like at the beginning, the preface to the Living Great Lakes is just fierce. There's a fierceness in there, and I think that comes with age, as we get younger. You know, don't we look younger? And you know, you want to preserve this. You know, you've got grandchildren, and you want to make sure that when they step out here in 15 years, they're going to step into the Boardman River, and there's going to be a trout in it.
When I think of your work, I think of Roberto Bolano, his comment, there's a time for poetry and a time for fists. And I admire that about you. You're not afraid to throw down the gloves and get tangled up in there. So I think it's good.
Yeah.
Both approaches are useful and necessary.
I do too. There's no question that they're both viable and they're valuable tools in the discussion about what we're going to do with this water. There's no question.
Well, I can begin by saying that for about 15 years, I've been trying to understand what we mean by the sense of place, and especially what we mean by the place that we are in right now, northern Michigan, within the Great Lakes region. And the more I travel around the region, the more people I talk to, and the more I study it, the less certain I am that I can quite get my arms around it. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Great Lakes, first of all, has been overlooked so much by so many people, because it is so complex and it is such a large area. It stretches across a quarter of the continent. And it's also why the people who do know it are so passionate about protecting the lakes. So I have set out in my books to try to describe a little bit about that complexity. And Mike mentioned earlier the prologue to The Windward Shore.
Prologue,
And that may be the only time I ever come close to expressing a little about that complexity and the meaning of it to me. So I'll just read a portion of it. These 5 astonishing seas of fresh water that once were as secure as money in the bank remain our epicenter, our capital, our strength, and our delight, but are no longer secure. This land that is as sprawling and messy, gorgeous and ugly, dynamic, diverse, complex, perplexing, heartening, and heartbreaking as the 2 nations that encircle it. This is my home. It is not an easy place to know, nor is any place. Many explorers of the near at hand have discovered that one lifetime isn't enough to learn a country, a town, even a backyard. Walk a trail a dozen times and you remain a stranger to it. 100 times and you might earn a nodding acquaintance. Walk it in snow, in rain, alone, and in company with kids and dogs and friends, under a full moon and a new moon, in the fog, in a blizzard, with your eyes shut and your feet seeking the way by touch, and maybe you'll become familiar enough to call it by name. But do you know it? When children memorize a song or a poem, they say they have learned it by heart. I'm trying to learn this land, my home, by heart, but I don't know if my heart is big enough. And I don't know if I'm writing a love song or a lament. Both probably, both and more, for a complex subject requires a complex song.
That gets exactly at the heart of what's so important about your work to me, is that you understand that the information that you get comes in through your 5 senses. It's not digital, it's not on the internet, it's about getting wet and getting cold and getting hot and getting hungry and getting thirsty and literally getting it all through your feet. I'll tell you, that preface or prologue should be read at the beginning of every session of Congress, just so they get it. It so purifies what it means to be a witness to that, because you got to know stuff. That's what it is. You can't make this stuff up, So I'm gonna in concert with that, I'm gonna read a poem from the Mad Angler, which is it's kind of apocalyptical, which is what happens if we stop, if something happens and we can't push this back. Like, the great irony in what you read is it was thought it would be money in the bank. Well, a lot of guys see the Great Lakes as bank. They see it as money. Export it, bring tankers in from, Arizona, and suck up water out of the Great Lakes and take it to Arizona at midnight. So this is called the Mad Angler's Restitution. Already the swamps have dried up. Each day becomes more like a desert than some flowing heart. He swears off rivers, begins the slow process of unlearning the bends he loves, loses track of his favorite runs and pools where he has cashed in his precious time. The rods go up in flames, the sweet smell of bamboo mixing with resin, the dust and blood of boyhood creels. He speaks into an overcast sky, asking what it will take to make up for all the times he thought he knew what he was doing. The arrogance of admiring perfect casts, forgetting to slip brook trout easily back into the river's seams, how his body and mind bent to the shape of each day on the water. All of it taken for granted, his laughter under dark cedars, sweet cigars, his beating heart, even the moon. I mean, it just, unless we do something, it's just not going to be here. I mean, it's like we were talking before. It's coming. You know, it never stops coming. Which is, I mean, where does it come from? It's coming out of aquifers that you can't see. You know, there are millions of gallons of water underneath us. You know, I've got a map in the hallway in the cabin of every lake, river, stream, and creek in Michigan. And it's hard to see because it's a little dark in there, but it's all blue. And if you imagine the aquifers underneath that, I mean, we're literally floating on water in this state. Every place is like an island to me. And, you know, if you pump it and sell it, it's gone. If you defile it, it's gone. You get to be the first moralist.
Well, I always bristle a little when someone accuses environmentalists of being opposed to change. Mm-hmm. That's a dismissive statement intended to stop dialogue. And actually, what environmentalists are looking at is ways to protect resources so that they will be healthy for many generations down the line. And it's really harkens back to the Native American idea that every decision should be based thinking about the consequences on 7 generations. Mm-hmm. And it's a real interesting time in history to be thinking that way because we're almost precisely 7 generations in from the first colonization by Europeans of North America. And look at the consequences. If those decisions had been made 7 generations ago, we might have a very different world right now. I love steelhead. I think steelhead are magnificent fish, and I really enjoy fishing for them. But in a river like the Boardman, which has had at least 50 years without any plantings, that's 50 years of genetic adaptation and purity, even though brown trout are not in fact, brook trout aren't native to this river either. Right. Both were introduced, but they've been here so long, they've found a real balance in their environment. By introducing anadromous fish, steelhead and salmon, into this water, we're going to see what's happened on rivers like the Pere Marquette and the Betsy, where the native or the resident trout are displaced and they're subjected to disease and all the bad stuff that comes with it. So I'm opposed to letting those fish up here.
You know, I wonder about that purity in the, you know, when you think about the fact that like brook trout, I love to catch brook trout. And when you think about the brook trout in the Boardman, and there hasn't been a planting in 50 years. So with every generation, the wildness seems to come back a little bit more. So it pushes back the stock of that fish that came from a plant stock to a more wild stock. I mean, it's probably mathematically impossible to think there are enough generations to get rid of that old stock, and so they're all purely wild fish. But when I look at the river now, and I think about the wild fish in it, that I call them wild, but they are truly wild, but they're wilder than any fish that have been introduced in the last 50 years. And so when I think about the change that might affect the river in terms of putting steelhead and salmon, I don't think salmon are an issue now. I think the salmon fishery in Michigan is collapsing. There's no food. But to me, in my mind, the DNR has always wanted to make the Boardman into a steelhead stream. That will require a dramatic change in the river. They ravage rivers. The human cost, the human population of chasing steelhead is going to, in my mind, is going to really have a dramatic negative effect on the river. It's a bad idea, and the only reason that idea exists to put steelhead in this river is money, because every fish caught in Michigan, every sport fish caught in Michigan has a value assigned to it, and You know, steelhead fishermen come in, they spend money here, they spend money there. And so it's an economic decision. It's not a decision to me that's made for the health of the river. It's not a decision that's made for the health of the brook trout population. And to me, it's going to be a disaster. I mean, especially, you know, I'm a riparian owner on the river, and I'm pretty cantankerous sometimes out here, but I don't want to see hundreds of fishermen chasing steelhead up here, because that means a lot of junk in the river. That old mentality of treble hooks and snagging is still alive, although I don't think steelhead fishermen are nearly as prone to that as salmon fishermen, but that's a mentality that's out there. And so the big fight on the Boardman is going to be about introducing steelhead into the river, and the back door of that is because the tribe has lots of ownership over the river, and what happens on the river is whether or not they might reintroduce sturgeon up here. And I'd love to see sturgeon back in the river, but that's a whole new policing problem. In a department that is already strapped for money, they can't enforce. You know, if you have sturgeon coming up the river, they're protected. So who's going to watch those fish?
The only way it works on the Black River up by Onaway is that there's a large group of local volunteers who guard the river day and night,
24/7.
Exactly.
And there's a lottery, I think, where they get to pick. Maybe that's only in the winter when they're ice fishing. Isn't there a lottery where they spear sturgeon for like
winter,
15 minutes or something?
Yeah, they only allow
not very many, which is good. I don't think you
Yeah.
should be spearing any sturgeon. You know, they're magnificent fish. Yeah. Just leave them alone. Let them be sturgeon. You know.
But they're very vulnerable when they're in the rivers,
Yeah.
so you need someone there to guard them against poachers.
Yep.
Simple as that, because they're valuable.
Yeah. So in terms of climate change, I always transfer that to human ecology. That more people come in here as a result of the climate. You know, it's warmer. It's going to get warmer. There are beaches here. More people. All these articles about what a great place this is to be. That means more people on the water, more people that don't understand the water. And so there needs to be a major education program about what rivers are, that they're living entities. It's not like going to a hotel where there's a river in the hotel and it's a water park. But on Saturday afternoon, that's what it looks like out here. It looks just like that.
Yeah, the question of the question of what should take precedent, an endangered species or human lives and livelihoods. It's a really interesting question. There was an excellent in-depth radio program produced a couple years ago in Mile about that issue. Do you remember when during one of the controlled burns for the Kirtland Warbler habitat, the fire got away from them, and they brought in volunteer firemen to control the fire, and one of the firemen got caught in the fire and killed, and he was killed. That. And the Mile community really went into turmoil over this.
Exactly.
They were divided. Some people were saying nothing is worth this, and others were saying, but this bird, if it's gone forever, and we don't know the impact on that. I don't know the answer to that. I would not know how to, on which side of the fence to land on that when it becomes a matter of life and death for people. But every biologist working in the field now says that if we start losing species, and we are losing species, lots of them, as we're losing species, we're losing some kind of stability within the whole planet. It's not just a regional problem. And the old idea of a three-legged stool is always applicable. You take away one of those legs, that stool is going to fall over. And it's been seen over and over that in habitats where a certain tipping point is reached with species loss, that habitat is lost. And boy, where does that put us as not just individuals making a livelihood and our own lives, but as a species? Are we endangering our entire species?
Yeah, isn't there a name for it seems like it's the butterfly effect.
Oh, the butterfly effect.
Yeah, where the demise of a species just ripples out through every species.
Yeah.
And it's like that Ray Bradbury story where he goes back in time, and he's told repeatedly, don't get off the path, and he steps on a butterfly. And he kills this butterfly, and it just completely changes the dynamic of human history, because that ripple effect of what happens when you lose a single creature. The idealist in me says, at all costs you preserve species. And then, like Jerry, I say, do you want to lose your life to save a chipmunk? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I just don't know. You talked about 7 generations. The theory is that within 7 generations of your life, you're forgotten. Nobody knows who you were. You weren't even here, really. You ceased literally to exist. But how long is this river going to exist? Yeah. Another 10,000 years? 20,000? I mean, what's this place going to look like 1,000 years from now? If Traverse City keeps moving like it moves, there's going to be a shopping mall here, And I'm glad I'm not going to be here to see that.